Hello and welcome to this 60-minute presentation on the health effects of electromagnetic fields. This is a presentation made for the Alternative Medicine College of Canada, and this is supposed to be a complement to the course module F225 of the naturopathic program syllabus. This is our agenda for the next hour or so. We will start by discussing some of the newly discovered properties of water and how these can explain the endogenous electromagnetic fields produced in the cells. Throughout, we'll discuss the implications this has for homeopathy, and we will then move on to healing and therapeutic electromagnetic fields and detrimental electromagnetic fields with some practical tips as to how to shield ourselves from these negative electromagnetic fields. There has been some very new and exciting research on the properties of water. For the longest time, of course, we used to think that water could only exist in three states, which is ice, liquid water, and vapor. We have now learned through recent science that water has a fourth phase called exclusion zone water. Why this is important is because this can really explain a lot of observations that we have made about biological systems and which this far had remained quite unexplained. We used to think that the water in our cells would behave exactly like liquid water in a glass. But we now know that water in our cells, because it is surrounded by a particular membrane and because it contains a great deal of different solutes, protein, fats, minerals, ions, it behaves more like a gel. And it is this gel-like water that scientist Gerald Pollack has named exclusion zone water, or the fourth state or fourth phase of water. To understand this better without going into complex physics, here are a few diagrams. Exclusion zone water is negatively charged. So basically the water separates itself into protons, which are positive hydrogen ions, and negative hydroxide ions. And so exclusion zone water, because of the way those ions distribute themselves, tends to have a negative charge. So we see here above on the top right-hand side. On the left side is the side of the beaker, and then we have a vertical band, which is the easy water, which is negatively charged, and the rest of the water, which behaves more like normal liquid water, which we also call bulk water, has a positive charge. Because polar charges will attract, the bulk water will organize itself so that its positive charge is close to the negatively charged easy water. This is very relevant because it essentially means that the inside of the cell, because of its water content and easy water content in particular, will be negatively charged, and that the outside of the cell in comparison is positively charged. In essence, this means that the cell can behave like a battery. So we see on the bottom diagram, if we were to connect a cable from the negative easy water side to the positive bulk water side, we could essentially create a current traveling from the negative to the positive side. We have known that the cell is negative on the inside for a long time, but we ascribe that to the sodium-potassium pump, which is a pump located in the membrane of the cell and which pumps sodium and potassium ions so as to concentrate negative charge on the outside of the cell and on the inside of the cell and positive charge on the outside of the cell. Through the discovery of easy water and its properties, we are now understanding that the pump is not as important as we thought, and that perhaps it is the structure of water itself that's in a way passively allows the cell to have this negative charge on the inside. It seems that exclusion zone water is also capable, because of its structure, of absorbing energy from light. And that is what we see on the top left diagram, where again, on the left, we see the side of the beaker. In the middle, the vertical band is the easy water, and then on the right-hand side, it is bulk water, which has been stained and prepared for us to be able to visualize it. And so at the top, it is when the water has not been exposed to light, and we see what happens to the easy water band once it has been exposed to light. It becomes wider. The easy water band essentially expands under the influence of water. This is interesting in the naturopathic setting because a lot of traditional medical systems like Ayurveda and the yogic tradition have always told us that there is prana or chi or essentially vital energy in sunlight, and that exposure to sunlight is part of health. Through our understanding of easy water, there are some models which actually now tell us that when we expose ourselves to sunlight, the energy from sunshine is absorbed into the easy water molecules, and this energy is then what is able to be converted into biochemical signaling energy. So this would be, in a way, a link between vital energy from sunlight and biochemical processes in the cell. In a way, that is quite a new way of thinking about the cell and metabolism and energy. So very fascinating. When we talk about electromagnetic fields, easy water becomes particularly relevant, as we can see from this diagram, which comes from a published study. So we see here at the top of the diagram, we have the bulk water molecules, which then organize themselves in the middle diagram, or the B part of the diagram, as easy water. So suddenly the water molecules are aligned in a particular way due to the structure of water, the fact that it has solutes in the water, and that they are surrounded by a membrane. Once bulk water has organized itself into easy water is able, because of its charge and structure, of emitting certain low frequency electromagnetic signals or a certain low frequency electromagnetic field. And then the easy water molecules that are emitting the same vibration will essentially attract each other to form bubbles, which in physics they now call coherent domains, or regions where the same electromagnetic signal or field is present throughout. And these small coherent domains will then attract each other to form larger regions with the same electromagnetic signal. And these coherent domains can allow the signal to propagate far and wide, thus explaining certain biological phenomena which up until now we could only really explain through hormones or the actual presence of nerves. But we now know that the structure of water itself is enough for different cells to be organized together in clusters according to a vibrational coherence. And so cells can then get organized according to which organs they are meant to help function. And so that it is the electromagnetic fields from the cells due to easy water that allows this organization to be possible. So hopefully this is pretty clear, although it is a quick crash course in quantum physics. The properties of easy water also allow us to understand better an interesting observation that's been made for a long time, which is that when we visualize red blood cells under a microscope, red blood cells, which are the discs here that you can see on this slide, will tend to attract each other and form rolls. And this never made sense to anybody because red blood cells also have a charge, and because single red blood cells have the same charge, they should normally repel each other, because it is normally only a positive and a negative that will attract, but two negatives or two positives will repel each other. But instead, those red blood cells find each other to form these rolls. And what's even more interesting is that if you mix red blood cells from different species, red blood cells from similar species tend to find each other. So if you mix dog red blood cell with human red blood cell with mouse red blood cell, Then the dog red blood cells will find each other to form a roll, and the mouse red blood cells will find each other to form another roll, and so on and so forth. So red blood cells from different species do not form rolls. The only exception to that has been if we mix rat red blood cell with mouse red blood cell. They are able to form a roll, presumably due to the biological similarity between these cousin species. Now that we understand easy water better and the fact that similar electromagnetic signals carried by the easy water can find each other and attract each other to form these coherent domains, we seem to have a better understanding of how these red blood cell rolls can occur. And they basically will tend to come together due to the principle of vibrational similarity. So now that quantum physics is starting to explain this better for us, it is really difficult not to think of Hahnemann and his law of similars from homeopathy, that like cures like. So in homeopathy, after we have done an intake and grasped the clinical picture of our patient, presumably this clinical picture represents a certain vibrational signature, which is pathological, and that the body is not looking after. We'll therefore try to find a remedy that has the same matching pathological signal, so that when we feed this remedy to our client, that pathological or negative vibrational signature is amplified, and that shows the body that something is amiss and our vital force will correct itself. And so now it seems that through quantum physics and easy water, we might have a little bit of an explanation of how this may happen. It is possible that when we take in the remedy, coherent domains that align with this remedy would kind of come together and send a long-range signal, electromagnetic signal, that would be picked up somehow by our vital force, who would then correct itself back to its vibrational signature of health. This also helps us to understand how our mindset or the electromagnetic frequency that we emit when we're sitting with our patient in our practice may have a far-reaching impact, because if they're able to resonate with our own vital force and health, it might in fact affect their easy water, and as such help them go back to a place of health. So we know now that endogenous electromagnetic fields emitted by our cells and the easy water in our cells are actually very necessary for cellular organization. So organization within the cell, but also organization across cells within a similar organ system. And because there's a lot of research on cancer, and because cancer cells are essentially disorganized, this becomes a very interesting source of studies. So cancer cells have lost their ability to be differentiated, so they become more like stem cells in a way. So they revert to the way our cells were in our very early embryonic life, in that the cell, let's say from breast tissue or prostate or lung tissue, de-differentiates, and it also loses its ability to recognize when it's time to stop multiplying. So normally when a cell is healthy, if there is tissue regeneration that needs to occur, the cell will sense that there is less cellular density around it, and that will be a signal for it to start dividing. When the density of cells around it is back to a place of health, that sends a signal for the cell to stop dividing, and cancer cells do not sense that signal anymore, which is why they continue multiplying nonstop until it kills the parent organism. So cancer cells are essentially disorganized, and what we are learning is that their transmembrane potential is different from a healthy cell. So if we take a neuron and we measure, we find that its transmembrane potential is from -50 to -80 millivolts. But when we study a cancer cell, we now see that it is less negative than a healthy cell, with a transmembrane potential of -30 to 0 millivolts. So interestingly enough, the cancer cell is not only obviously disorganized and has lost the ability of functioning in cooperation with other cells within an organism, but cancer cells have also lost their vibrational coherence. So they no longer have the healthy endogenous electromagnetic field that you would expect in a healthy cell. And that's very interesting, and that is also how we've learned that these endogenous electromagnetic fields are essential for cellular organization due to easy water and the coherent domains that they form. So the next question, of course, is, well, if there are endogenous electromagnetic fields that can be disturbed, as we see in a cancer cell, what about the effects of external electromagnetic fields on our cells? And unsurprisingly, we're now learning that external EMFs can also be absorbed by easy water, can also create coherent domains, and therefore can also create a negative or a positive effect within the cell. In fact, this has been studied for the last 80 years, and we have at least 25,000 studies on external electromagnetic fields and their effect on the cell. In particular, we have learned that if we apply an external electromagnetic field on a cell, it has a much stronger biological effect if it is a pulsatile electromagnetic field. In other words, a continuous external electromagnetic field doesn't do much to the cell compared to a pulsed electromagnetic field. And so there are studies on what is now called PEMFs, or pulsed electromagnetic fields, that have been around for a long time. And in particular, we've learned that these pulsed EMFs are particularly great for bone and cartilage regeneration. And so they are used to heal fractures, for instances, and that has been done for a long time. So there are treatment devices such as this mat connected to a plastic container, which are pulsed EMF devices that one can purchase, or one can go to a practice where these devices are available. PEMF devices are apparently treated differently than other medicinal machines, and so are not subject to the same type of FDA approval, and for this reason they are quite readily available. And in particular for fractures and cartilage treatments, they have been used for a long time, and their biological effects are well known. So in summary, we've known for a long time that external EMFs have an effect on the cell, and that positive effects can be seen by the usage of pulsed EMF. Because of our interest in EMFs and cellular organization, there are, of course, also studies on what external EMFs will do to cells and whether they turn into cancer cells or not. There was one large study that was done which took a look at 123 studies that had been performed since 1965 on the effects of external electromagnetic frequencies on cellular health and cancerous changes. And basically, they have showed that external EMFs, and depending on the frequency used, can have a positive or a negative effect on whether the cell turns into cancer or not. We can see here on the horizontal axis, this is the frequency that is applied to the cell, and if the effect is beneficial, they will have labeled that frequency range in green. If the effect on the cell is that it turns it to a cancer cell or creates cancerous changes, they will have color-coded it in red. And it turns out that there is this alternating band due to the physics of electromagnetic waves, which we won't go into detail for now. But this is to show that there are well-respected traditional physics and biology studies that are looking at these effects. And so from there to actually trying to treat cancer with pulsed EMF, there is really just one step. And in fact, this is a case study from 2014, which basically outlines what was done in France, where a person that had advanced pancreatic cancer and was only given 6 months to live chose to collaborate with their oncologist and to also get a hold of a pulsed EMF machine called the Rife-Bear machine and to use that to try and get rid of their cancer. And after less than 2 months of exposure to these beneficial EMFs, the tumor completely disappeared in about 2 weeks. So this is very promising and shows us that the future of cancer research is most likely not in biochemical molecules per se, but in a better understanding and grasp of electromagnetic fields and their effects on biological systems. Interestingly enough, this is nothing very new, since the Rife-Bear machine that is being used in this study has actually been around since the 1930s. And it's actually very interesting to learn a little more about the inventor of the Rife machine, which is Dr. Royal Raymond Rife, who was an American scientist who had graduated from Johns Hopkins University, born in 1888 and died in 1971, so not that recent. And Dr. Rife basically worked on his own in his lab, and he invented what he called the universal microscope, which we see here on the picture. It had many, many different parts, and it could enlarge up to between 20 and 60,000 times, zooming into structures. And unlike our modern day microscopes, the Rife universal microscope was able to keep bacteria and viruses alive during the observation. So nowadays, for example, with an electron microscope, we need to kill the pathogen before we're able to visualize it with the electron beam. Whereas with Rife's universal microscope, we could see what the live bacteria or virus in action looked like. And that was a very big advantage because after 1929, when he had perfected his universal microscope and observing these viruses and bacteria, Royal Rife became convinced that it is actually viruses in particular that are at the origin of cancerous changes in the cell. And this was only 1930, but today this is not a very surprising thing to learn about because we know, for example, that the HPV virus is very much involved in cervical cancer, that Hep B and Hep C viruses are involved in liver cancer. So this notion for us today is not new, but that was quite something to say back in the day of Royal Raymond Rife. And because he was observing live viruses with his microscope, he was then able to test what would happen if you sent an external electromagnetic signal to these live bacteria and viruses, and he observed that they would die or be destroyed only when exposed to a specific EMF frequency that was particular and targeted to that pathogen. And so Royal Raymond Rife came up with a very long list of different EMF frequencies and which pathogen they would effectively target. And because he worked on his own and he was not really affiliated with the medical politics of the time, it's only in 1934 that he convinced a university to run a clinical study using his machine, the Rife machine. They recruited 16 patients with different types of terminal cancer, and the treatment involved a 3-minute exposure to the Rife machine for 3 days at the frequency that Raymond Rife felt was useful for their particular kind of cancer. And all of them were cured within 3 months. Apparently, the research was not properly reproduced in other labs, and generally speaking, the medical community did not take well to the Rife machine at all because they did not recognize that electromagnetic frequencies could have a biological effect, and so the whole thing seemed really out there. As a result, Royal Raymond Rife's invention was never really accepted in classical medical treatments. And our poor Dr. Rife was also subject to harassment by the American Medical Association, who sent people to ransack his lab, The list that he had painstakingly come up with different frequencies to address and destroy different bacteria and viruses was stolen and destroyed. Years of research were destroyed. One of his collaborators was murdered. And because he was not well connected, Dr. Reif unfortunately died bitter, rejected, probably an alcoholic. And in his 80s, he was found to have died from a mixture of antidepressants and alcohol. So it's a very sad story, and potentially the Reif machine was the way towards curing different types of cancer. But thankfully, in the 70s, James Baer, an engineer, decided to learn himself a little more about the Reif machine. And today there are various websites where we are able to get what is now called a Baer Reif machine, which is basically Raymond Reif's old machine, the concept of it, slightly improved through modern technological means. And because these kinds of machines are apparently not subjected to the same kind of FDA regulations as other medical interventions, one is able to purchase these simply on the website. It costs a few $1,000s. If you're a naturopath and thinking of having this in your practice, I would still caution you that this is not recognized by any naturopathic or medical legal body. And so if a cancer patient would want to use this on your recommendation, you would really need to inform them adequately, have them sign a form to protect yourself legally should it not work, so that you're not sued or get into legal trouble. But this is very promising, and the fact that there is now a case study of a person with pancreatic cancer using this machine, I think really opens the door for a lot of new, novel therapeutic interventions with cancer. Much earlier than the modern Baer Reif machine, we also, of course, had the Mora machine, which is quite well known in naturopathic circles, because it was invented in the 70s by Dr. Franz Morel, who was a German homeopath and who collaborated with Eric Rache, his son-in-law, who was an electrical engineer, to develop something that Dr. Morel hoped would be a somehow more modern version of homeopathy. So if you recall, in homeopathy, by taking the clinical picture of the patient, we hope to match it with a remedy that would have the same vibrational signature, which is presumably the signature of the illness within the patient. And so by giving a homeopathic remedy to the patient, we're essentially feeding the patient back with an amplified version of the pathological electromagnetic wave. And because there's a lot of trial and error in classical homeopathy, Dr. Morel wanted to invent a machine that would basically detect the electromagnetic frequency coming out of the patient and figure out which one are the healthy ones and which ones are the unhealthy ones. And the machine would then identify the unhealthy vibrations or electromagnetic waves and either amplify them, just like in homeopathy, and feed them back into the body of the patient via an electrode, or the Mora machine, or what was then named the Mora machine, would invert and cancel out the wave and send that back into the patient. So that has been around since the late 70s and is readily available in homeopathic practices, and some naturopaths also choose to practice with the Mora machine. The Mora machine looks like this, so it's a relatively portable machine with a lot of knobs and several electrodes. And typically, as you can see on this picture, the patient will be hooked up to the machine and the practitioner will make various measurements on acupuncture points or along meridians, which are known to be areas where those vibrations and electromagnetic signals can be better picked up and detected. Although, again, the Mora machine is not recognized by any medical body in particular, there are actually a number of studies on it, particularly coming out of Germany, who seem to show that using the Mora machine is particularly helpful in childhood allergies like eczema, asthma, allergic rhinitis, And because it's been around for a long time, we do know that it is quite a safe machine to use. It's very different from the Rife machine because the Mora machine uses the like cures like principle of homeopathy, whereas Dr. Royal Raymond Rife was not at all a homeopath, and he was looking really for vibrational frequencies that would destroy certain bacteria or viruses. So when we use a Bear Rife machine today and we adjust the frequency, we are looking at a destructive frequency for various pathogens in the body. Whereas with the Mora machine, we are just amplifying what we pick up in the patient's body and feeding it back in hopes that the vital force will act. Along the same lines, in terms of machines that can be used in naturopathic practice, we have, of course, Hulda Clark's Zapper, which is quite famous and is named after Dr. Hulda Clark, who was a Canadian naturopath born in 1928 and deceased really only about 10 years ago. She had done a lot of research from her PhD in physiology, and she also felt, just like Royal Raymond Rife, that it was pathogens that causes chronic illness and cancer in the cell, but she attributed that mostly to parasites. And so her machine is called the Zapper, and it can be made at home very simply with very basic electronic parts and a simple 9-volt battery. And what the Zapper does, it is set to a very a single electromagnetic signal that can only affect one bacteria, parasite, or virus. So for example, one could make or purchase a zapper for only about $15, which is set on the frequency to zap, let's say, some intestinal parasite. But with the zapper, you cannot adjust the frequency and zap or emit signals against other bacterioviruses other than the one that is pre-programmed. Also, because the Clark Zapper can be built with very simple electronic parts, the frequency is not very precise. So, although you might buy a zapper for a particular parasite, the frequency will vary. It's not that robust. And Hulda Clark said that it didn't really matter because you were still providing the body with an electromagnetic signal that was close to the pathogenic signal, and that would be enough for the body to, so to speak, notice the negative frequency, and that it would then in a way boost its own vital electromagnetic signal to restore health and destroy certain pathogens. So in a way, Clark Zapper has some similarities with the Bear Rife machine, but at the same time, because the zapper is set on one frequency, it is different because the Bear Rife machine, which also costs several $1,000s and not just $15 like Clark's Zapper, the Bear Rife machine, you can adjust the frequency depending on the pathology that you're trying to address. So you can customize your frequency depending on which bacteria, parasite, or virus you'd like to see destroyed. But the Bear Rife machine, Hulda Clark Zapper, and the Mora machine are all machines that can be used in the naturopathic practice. But I would be careful about making public, bold claims about those because we do not have a lot of substantial research behind them. Although it seems to start now that there's more of a recognition that electromagnetic fields do play a part in cellular health and cellular organization. When we understand the role of easy water in the cell, the role of coherent domains, the role of endogenous electromagnetic fields, and we understand that there are external electromagnetic fields which can be beneficial to the cell and to health, of course, the next question that ensues is how about external electromagnetic fields that maybe have negative effects on the body? And that is, of course, a very good question. And the last part of our presentation will be dedicated to those harmful EMFs, especially since they've become such an important topic of conversation in the modern day world where we're literally bombarded with negative EMFs daily. So as you can see here, this is the common picture of the electromagnetic spectrum, where the spectrum is made up of waves that range from the non-visible to the visible frequencies. And the frequencies will differ in their wavelength, of course, but also, as you can see, the actual frequency of the waves. So on the left-hand side, we tend to have the low frequency and gradually increasing towards the right-hand side. The left-hand side here, which is labeled in purple, is what we call non-ionizing radiation, which is for the most part not so dangerous compared to what is on the right-hand side in red, which we call ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is radiation that will gradually destroy structures such as DNA and cells in our body, such as X-ray and gamma rays or radioactive rays. For the most part, when we're talking about harmful EMF, we are talking about non-ionizing radiation. So in that purple band here, you see on the left-hand side, we have low frequency radiation, such as the Schumann waves, which are emitted by our planet. So planet Earth, natural ecosystems will emit a low frequency wave. And we know that this low frequency Schumann wave is associated with better health, and that if we hang out in nature, like at a lake, in a forest, next to a waterfall, we are exposing ourselves to more Schumann waves, and that is basically good for us. It is possible that our cell's endogenous electromagnetic signal is somehow pegged or connected to the Schumann signal. What we know is that for the last 100,000 years, since we've come on this planet as a species, we were not exposed to any other electromagnetic signals except for that of the sun through UV light and the Schumann radiation from our planet. So that we have co-evolved with these signals makes no doubt. Their full effect on our body is not fully understood, except that it is most likely beneficial. If we move from the extremely low frequency signals emitted by the planet, we then move to electrical current, TV, and radio signal, which is for the most part safe. And then we move into telephone antennas, smartphones, Wi-Fi, which we're gradually learning is actually more problematic than we once thought. Then we move into microwave, which is of course unsafe, and then into infrared, UV, and finally into ionizing radiation. Sometimes people get a little bit confused because when we talk about EMF radiation, it is usually associated with it's bad. But then because we spoke about pulsed EMF earlier today and we said it was good, sometimes it can be confusing. And one way to understand this is to understand that the Rife machine or pulsed EMF devices in general will use very low frequencies at the low frequency end of the spectrum. And so for this reason, they are much safer than smartphone, Wi-Fi, other phone signals that are closer to the microwave range. And those are the ones that we're going to talk about now as being problematic because our body has only in the last decade or so been exposed to such high amounts of Wi-Fi and phone EMF radiation without really any studies on it until recently. So this is a topic that I predict will become more and more relevant in the naturopathic practice. And so it is good to have at least a working knowledge of the effects of harmful electromagnetic signals in our environments. Again, generally speaking, large phone companies, medicine, and the public at large will tend to deny the harmful effects of electromagnetic fields around us. But of course, now that we understand quantum physics, or some of it when it comes to easy water and the effects of endogenous electromagnetic fields in the cell, it's hard to expect there to be external EMF fields that would be completely neutral or harmless to the cell. And in fact, we now have proper conventional clinical studies, this one comes out of France, that shows us that there is now a confirmed and established link between cell phone usage and brain cancer. What we understand so far is that because we are made up of 80% water in our bodies, and a lot of this water is actually easy water, which is very good at carrying electromagnetic signals. This is what happens on this slide. When we are holding a phone to our ear, the electromagnetic signal will be picked up by the easy water, and it will then travel to a more extended region of our brain through the principle of coherent domains, which we talked about earlier. So in an adult, you see this reddish yellowish zone is the zone of the brain that will be affected by this negative electromagnetic radiation. In a 10-year-old, you see the signal propagates deeper in the brain, and in a 5-year-old, even deeper. And that's simply because the younger a person, the more hydrated they are. So the water content in a child's body is much higher than in an adult's body. And also children, generally speaking, have bigger heads proportional to their bodies, but also smaller heads proportional to an adult head. So it'll take the same electromagnetic signal will basically penetrate deeper in a child's head. And so in that way, because we tend to hold the phone to our ear and close to our head, it is not a surprise that the better documented harmful effect of electromagnetic radiation from our phone, our Wi-Fi, and our computers is on the risk of developing glioma, which is a form of aggressive brain cancer that typically affects young people below 25, which is of course a bit of a scary thought. Acoustic neuroma, which is basically a cancer of the acoustic nerve, is the other one that is well established. So there really is a link between using our cell phone close to our head and a higher risk of developing both glioma and acoustic neuroma. This is very well documented. We also know that harmful electromagnetic fields will reduce both male and female infertility, simply because in our gonads, which is our testes and ovaries, the DNA that it holds seems to be more fragile to environmental assaults such as heavy metals, pollutants, but also negative types of electromagnetic frequency. Other kinds of cancers are also increased, as well as neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer and senile dementia. So that may also be linked to external harmful EMFs in our environments. It's interesting to see that although phone companies completely deny the existence of harmful effects of EMFs, and that a lot of cities are now thinking of moving to 5G, or basically more exposure to smartphone negative waves. The World Health Organization does recognize EMF sensitivity as a real disorder. So some people will sense that their bodies is exposed to too much cell phone and Wi-Fi and computer radiation, and they will typically develop headaches, skin rashes, mood swings, body stiffness, chronic fatigue, kind of fibromyalgia type of picture. And for these people, it's a blessing, because once they find out that that's the problem and they shield themselves from the EMFs, they are probably not doing further damage in the body. Unlike for the rest of us who may not feel any of this EMF ill effects, but after years and years of it, we might put ourselves at risk for cancer, acoustic neuroma, and neurodegenerative disease. So phone companies will usually only say that EMFs have a thermal effect, so that they overheat tissues that have been chronically exposed to them, and will ignore other effects of EMFs, which is a little hypocritical because, as we showed earlier, there is a great deal of research behind pulsed EMF, to the point that we have therapeutic devices built to help people with fractures. So we know that EMFs have biological effects, and particularly pulsed EMFs. This is of particular concern because the radiation from electromagnetic fields for smartphone, Wi-Fi, and computer usage is pulsed. That means that when the phone is trying to dial a number to reach someone else, or when it is receiving an incoming call, or when it has to work hard, so to speak, to download some website, it is sending a pulse signal, which we know has stronger biological effects than a continuous signal. So we really want to protect ourselves from harmful electromagnetic fields. So generally speaking, our cell phones should not be used anywhere near our heads or near our ears. We should also make sure our children, especially if they're below 12 and still very well hydrated, that they should not use the phone anywhere close to their heads, and also not use the iPad or the computer connected to Wi-Fi close to their heads. In areas of poor reception, like for instance, in the elevator, in the subway, in a car, in the plane, during a thunderstorm, we should not use our cell phone or try to use our Wi-Fi, because the device then has to work a lot harder, or in other words, send a much stronger signal in order for it to work in these conditions. And the signal that we're exposing ourselves to will therefore be more intense as well. So in those areas of poor reception, we should really try to refrain using our devices. The airplane mode is something we should all become familiar with, because the airplane mode blocks any kind of EMF emission or reception on the phone, and that would include Bluetooth, which is also a form of electromagnetic radiation, which is bad for us. So we want to use the airplane mode as much as we can, like at night when we're sleeping, or for men in particular who tend to wear the phone in their pant pocket, it would be best for it to be on airplane mode. For ladies who use their phone in their handbag and their handbag is close to their body, you might also want to consider using the airplane mode when possible. At night, which is presumably 8 to 10 hours of our 24-hour day, we should not leave our phone or computer or Wi-Fi router anywhere near our bodies. So the closer we are to the signal source, the more we're exposed to an intense signal. As we move away from the device, the signal that we're exposed to is weaker and weaker. So our cell phone should be at least more than 2 meters away from our body at night, and it should be on airplane mode. If we use our phone as alarm, we can still use it as an alarm, and it can still be on airplane mode and a couple of meters away from our bodies at least. Ideally, we should really give up the wireless Wi-Fi router at home and at work and go back to a cabled Ethernet connection. This is what experts are telling us, because the quality of our internet would be just as good without the EMF downsides. However, this is very difficult for a lot of people, especially at work, where we don't necessarily have any control over what goes on with the Wi-Fi connection. So the next best thing to be to at least turn off the Wi-Fi router at night in our homes, or put aluminum foil over it at night, because that would also very much block the EMF signal. If you live in an apartment building, you may turn off your Wi-Fi router, but still be exposed to the Wi-Fi of all of the neighbors around you. There are other devices like blankets that you can use that are special to block EMF. But know that even if you're still exposed to your neighbor's EMF, you are still reducing the most intense signal that would presumably come from the nearest place, which would be in your apartment, when you turn off your router at night. So I would say it's still very much worth it. Although laptops are called laptops, we would ideally not want to use laptops on our lap, because then again, we are submitting our genital area to a deleterious electromagnetic field. And because the DNA in there is particularly sensitive, we wouldn't want that. And like I said earlier, we do not want our children to use our cell phone either to talk on the phone or to play games on the phone or on the tablet where their head is directly above the screen. Or if they're using it to play games, you definitely want to put your device on airplane mode. Nowadays, we also have sleeves, which are basically made of signal blocking materials that we can use for our phone as a phone case, or we can also use underneath our laptops to block the signal. So we see here on the diagram on the bottom right that this is what happens when we use this kind of protective sleeve. Basically, the signal is blocked on the side of our head so that the phone still receives a signal and we can continue to have a conversation and use our phone, but it doesn't penetrate into our heads as much because of the blockage of the signal. So I would really recommend such products. The one that I'm familiar with is a brand called Safe Sleeve that I'm not involved with in any ways, but seems to have good research behind it in terms of how it blocks the signal. You definitely want to use earphone like the Air earphones and not the Bluetooth ones. And you want to use speakerphone so that if you are talking on your smartphone, you're keeping the phone as far away from your head as humanly possible for the other party to still hear the conversation. So your patients may need to be educated about this as well. There is not much mainstream education on this, and yet our children are bathed in Wi-Fi radiation like never before. We're on our smartphones much more than before, and all of this is a bit of a vast experiment because it hasn't really been properly studied, and the studies that are out there really do show that these external electromagnetic waves have a negative impact on the body, but obviously this is information that many people don't really want us to know about. So this is our last slide, which is essentially our little summary slide and take-home message. This was a bit of a crash course in a small bit of quantum physics for us to understand how the newly discovered structure of water, called exclusion zone water, allows the cells to produce and store endogenous electromagnetic frequencies that can propagate themselves within the cell and along longer distances in the body, so that the organs can have a kind of vibrational coherence and therefore function healthfully. Based on this principle, we understand how certain therapeutic devices which emit electromagnetic frequencies can help with health. They can send a healthful signal to the cell, such as the Rife machine, other pulsed EMF machines, the Clark Zapper, and the Mora machine, which are based on the above principle. In that same vein, external electromagnetic fields can also be harmful, like the ones from Wi-Fi, phone, and computer, and should be minimized as much as possible, as we discussed earlier. And this can be a very relevant topic in the naturopathic practice because A, its mechanistic implications in homeopathy, and B, in how to educate our patients in getting proper sleep, proper nutrition, lowering stress levels, and also being careful of negative EMFs and potentially using positive EMFs to help them improve. So I hope this presentation was informative and interesting. We've come to the end of it now and wishing you all a very good day.